Hi, folks. Welcome back. So have you noticed that America feels like it's stuck in a group therapy session run by people who should be in one? We've got professional activists throwing tantrums, college campuses turning into psych wards with Wi-Fi, and tolerance now meaning screaming obscenities at anyone who doesn't vote Democrat. The left loves to brand itself as a side of compassion and progress, but somehow every time you scratch the surface, you find rage, violence, and an oddly specific obsession with what goes where in someone else's bedroom. Today, we're heading into the wild terrain of San Francisco, where logic basically goes to die, and apparently so does dignity. To watch a black woman confront Charlie Kirk and prove once again that being on the right side of history doesn't guarantee you've actually read any. So let's take a look at what happens when the party of love and inclusivity shows us what they really mean by progressive values.
I love you. And you know what I think? I think you really want a big black your ass.
Jesus.
Well, you seem pleasant. Are you married?
Was your mom married?
Are you married?
Because I got a call from the doctor. She missed her fucking abortion.
You seem so sweet.
Charlie, you seem so fucking stiff and white. Do you have a stick up your ass?
Is there something wrong with being white?
Charlie, is there something wrong with a stick in your ass is what I'm asking. I love you, Charlie. You're the best comedian. You're the best fucking comedian on.
Do you want a hat?
You're the best one.
She wants a hat. Can you wear it?
This is what the modern left calls dialogue, folks. A college campus, Charlie Kirk and Riley Gaines, and a woman so deranged, she sounds like a parody written by her own opposition. But this isn't satire. It's San Francisco State University in 2025, where public discourse has fully collapsed into a performance of mental instability masquerading as moral authority. What we just witnessed isn't an isolated meltdown. It's the logical end of a political movement that confuses vulgarity with virtue and rage with righteousness. And it didn't come out of nowhere. For years, the academic establishment has taught young Americans that identity is everything, history is oppression, and speech is violence, unless it's coming from them. Add TikTok narcissism, activist clout chasing, and a media culture that rewards humiliation over humility, and what do we get? A woman publicly sexualizing, insulting, and racially demeaning someone while believing she's the hero in the story. That's not actual resistance. That's just indoctrination with a mic. And by the way, notice how she takes over this situation. This wasn't meant to be a protest of ideas. There were no questions, no challenges, no demands, just projection, sexual vulgarity, and trauma cosplay. And if you dare to call it what it is, unhinged, you'll be labeled the oppressor, because the new left morality isn't about right or wrong, it's about power and attention. And in this universe, nothing screams power like humiliating your political opponents with the emotional maturity of a drunk heckler at a dive bar. This is where progressive politics has landed, not in policy debates or civic engagement, but in identity-based tantrums that absolve people of basic decency. Because when victimhood becomes currency, dignity becomes a liability. And on campuses like SFSU, the louder and more obscene the breakdown, the more you're applauded as brave. But in this situation, it was a little different because it was, after all, a Turning Point USA rally, so Charlie Kirk had a lot of supporters there. But let's be honest, the only reason this isn't sparking national outrage is because it fits the mainstream media's narrative. If Kirk had said anything even remotely as explicit or racially charged as this woman did, he'd be trending for hate speech with coordinated calls to deplatform him by breakfast. But because the outburst came from a black woman targeting a white conservative, it's either ignored or quietly celebrated as speaking truth to power. This is the double standard America's drowning in right now. One side gets moral immunity, the other gets moral crucifixion. And the result isn't just broken discourse, it's a generation allergic to accountability and addicted to applause for their worst instincts. It's not brave, it's not empowering, it's a cultural collapse dressed up in activist drag. Until we stop rewarding this kind of dysfunction, until universities stop coddling it, the media stops amplifying it, and the rest of us stop normalizing it, we're not just watching the death of dialogue, we're basically complicit in it. And speaking of freedom of speech, people are very upset about the Shiloh Hendricks situation. For those of you who don't remember, Shiloh Hendricks is the woman who, while defending her child, said the N-word towards another child. and was caught on camera later being confronted by somebody who was at the playground. Anyway, these folks are protesting at City Hall, demanding some kind of action over it.
We're looking for the woman in question to be charged.
You need to charge Shiloh.
Many in the community feeling uneasy.
I'm a black person myself and I have black children, and I worry about them every day when they go outside.
Speakers included officials from Rochester's Community Engagement Response Team.
Justice needs to be more than a word right now. It needs to become a standard, okay?
A representative of the Somali community.
The pain this child endured is a pain that echoes through every one of us.
And Mirkim Norton, who spoke on the city's effort to condemn racism and create a safe community for all.
The city of Rochester stands with you against all forms of discrimination, racism, and hate.
It's time to stop marching and we got to show some action.
As this story continues, protesters say they will continue to speak out against hateful speech and racism in the community.
This is where we are in 2025, folks. Grown adults, public officials, and entire activist coalitions rallying outside City Hall, not to protest violence, corruption, or economic collapse, but because a white woman said a word. Not hit anyone, not actually committed a crime, not burn a building down. She said a word. And that word, in this new secular religion often called wokeism, is apparently more dangerous than fentanyl, more offensive than genital mutilation clinics for minors, and more urgent than the rise in Somali gang violence in the very communities these protesters claim to represent. Needless to say, this isn't about justice. It's about moral theater. We've raised a generation so coddled, so ideologically fragile, that words, especially when spoken by the wrong kind of person, are treated as acts of war. And in a culture where victimhood is the highest form of capital, outrage becomes a career path. That's why you see Somali activists and BLM organizers standing shoulder to shoulder demanding that Shiloh Hendricks, a private citizen, be criminally charged over language. We don't have hate speech laws in this country, folks. It's never going to happen. But the reality is, this is pure selective outrage. Because if you comb through TikTok or visit any college campus open mic night, you'll find this same slur used casually, often by the very groups claiming ownership of it. You'll hear it in music. You'll see it in jokes. You'll hear it in memes. The difference is when it's said by the approved class, it's edgy or cultural. When it's said by someone outside that class, even without malice, it's treated like an act of terrorism. That isn't justice. That's racialized power politics dressed up in morality. Now, in case this isn't clear, what's happening here is the weaponization of identity for control. It's not about respect, it's about dominance. And the demand isn't equality, it's submission. Submit to the new rules, the new language, the new moral caste system, or we will ruin your life. We'll pressure the DA, we'll get the city council involved, we'll label you a racist, try to take your home away from you, threaten you, and paint you a danger to society over a word that every single one of those activists knows is used 1,000 times a day in their own cultural spaces without a blink. And this is the consequence of institutional cowardice, because instead of drawing a line between words and violence, between cultural discomfort and criminal action, our public institutions have chosen appeasement. You have council members and police reps and community engagement officers nodding along like this isn't insanity, like it's perfectly normal to demand felony charges over speech. They think if they throw the mob a bone, they'll be spared. But all they're doing is legitimizing a standard that can't be enforced equally because it was never meant to be. If justice is now determined by how offended someone claims to feel, then we no longer have law. We have emotional feudalism. And the goal isn't peace, it's power. The left's grip on the institutions, media, education, public discourse, has hollowed out the definition of racism until it simply means anything that challenges their authority. And we're watching the collapse of civic life because of it. So here's a hard truth. If we don't reclaim the distinction between real harm and symbolic offense, we're going to lose the very freedoms that allow us to live together in a pluralistic society. And that's exactly what the ideological left is counting on. They want obedience. They want compliance. They want speech, thought, and behavior filtered through the lens of their insecurities, because that's how they stay in control. This protest in Rochester is just the latest example of what happens when cultural fragility meets institutional surrender. And unless we start pushing back with clarity and courage, the future of this country won't be free. It'll be policed by mobs who cry justice while dismantling the very concept of it. And speaking of dismantling, somebody who desperately wants to dismantle America so she can replace this beautiful country with a failed communist state is AOC. Let's see what she recently had to say.
And now what DHS is trying to say, again, they're using public intimidation because they know that they cannot come for us all. They know that they cannot come for us all. And recently what they said is that DHS is allegedly looking into arresting members of Congress who were showing up for their legal and constitutional obligation to conduct oversight. If anyone's breaking the law in this situation, it's not members of Congress, it's the Department of Homeland Security.
Oh my gosh.
It's people like Tom Homan and Secretary Kristi Noem. You lay a finger on someone, on Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, on Representative or any of the representatives that were there, you lay a finger on them, we are going to have a problem. Because the people who are breaking the law are the people who are not abiding by it. And it is enshrined in the law that members of Congress who show up to ICE and CBP facilities are required to be granted access, legally required to be granted access. And they legally cannot be inhibited from accessing these facilities to conduct their constitutional obligation to investigate and conduct oversight. So if Kristi Noem wants to break the law, that's on her. But it sure as hell is not someone like Representative Robert Menendez that needs to be arrested, okay?
What you just heard wasn't a call to action, it was a threat. A member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, sitting on her Instagram Live, effectively daring federal law enforcement to arrest her allies while casting herself as a victim of tyranny. You lay a finger on them, and we are going to have a problem. That's not oversight. That's insurrection in a pantsuit. And once again, the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply when the left is the one storming federal buildings. Because when the right does it, it's an attack on democracy. But when the left does it, it's oversight. This is the terminal stage of activist governance, where elected officials no longer see themselves as stewards of the law, but as warriors above it. What AOC is doing here isn't defending the Constitution. She's literally hijacking it. She's wrapping radicalism in legalese, shouting about constitutional obligations while openly rejecting the consequences of breaking actual laws. Let's be clear. Members of Congress do have rights to conduct oversight, but that does not mean they're immune from the consequences of unlawful behavior, especially if they're obstructing or interfering with federal operations at ICE facilities. And that's the game. AOC is banking on Americans being too distracted or too afraid to call it for what it is: political intimidation dressed up as social justice. She frames any accountability as fascism, any enforcement of law as targeted repression, and any attempt to investigate her allies as an attack on democracy itself. But that's purely projection. She and her cohort of performative radicals have turned the language of civil rights into a shield for unlawful behavior, and they expect the rest of us to pretend it's noble. This is the same playbook we've seen over and over again in the last decade. Weaponize identity, frame every conflict as a moral crusade, then when challenged, escalate with martyrdom rhetoric like they can't come for us all. That's not democracy, that's cult logic. It's what you hear from people who see themselves not as public servants, but as revolutionary avatars fighting a system they supposedly govern. And that contradiction should terrify you. Because the moment a sitting Congresswoman can threaten federal agencies without consequences while her ideological allies torch Tesla dealerships and disrupt public order with zero accountability, you no longer have a republic. You have a hierarchy of impunity, a system where power is enforced by mob energy and shielded by media complicity. If a Republican has said anything even remotely close to this, there would be wall-to-wall coverage in mainstream media. MSDNC would be having an absolute meltdown for a whole week. There'd be House hearings and nonstop calls for resignation. But AOC gets away with it because her politics align with the dominant narrative that anything done in the name of equity is beyond reproach. And this is where the left's cultural dominance over media, academia, and public discourse becomes dangerous because it has insulated its most extreme voices from real scrutiny. People like AOC are no longer held accountable by journalists or fact checkers. They're rewarded for being inflammatory. They trend for threatening the rule of law and are treated like heroes for doing so. And in the absence of institutional pushback, they keep pushing further. Now, this isn't even just specifically about AOC. It's about what happens when activist politics becomes indistinguishable from governance, when threats replace arguments and the law becomes a matter of narrative control. If we want to restore sanity to public life, we need to stop pretending that progressive rage is synonymous with moral clarity. Because right now, the greatest threat to democratic norms isn't coming from fringe militias, it's coming from inside the House. And that House is Congress. So ask yourself, what kind of country do we become when the loudest voices in power treat law as optional, outrage as strategy, and threats as leadership? When those tasked with upholding order instead model rebellion, not for justice, but for control? At what point does activism turn into authoritarianism wearing a protest sign? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the reality we're currently living in. If those who claim to defend democracy are the first to trample its boundaries when it suits them, then maybe it's time we stop confusing volume with virtue. Maybe the real threat to this country isn't coming from outside the halls of power, but from those inside who think they're above consequence. You tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.